The courtyard smells of smoke and iron. A woman kneels, her wrists bound, her back bare beneath the Roman sun. Around her, citizens gather not to stop it, but to witness it. The iron glows red, the air hums, and when the metal meets her flesh, the sound is not a scream, but a branding. A letter, carved into her skin, claims her, not as a person but as property. This was not punishment for a crime. It was a declaration of ownership. In the empire that built aqueducts, philosophy, and law, pain itself became a language one used to mark obedience, purity, and control. Women were not just disciplined, they were labeled. Their bodies became the parchment on which Rome wrote its hierarchy. From slave markets to temples, from palaces to brothels, women carried the empire's signature on their skin, burned by law, sanctioned by religion, justified by men who called it order. But why did the greatest civilization of its time brand its women like cattle? What did Rome fear so deeply that it needed to sear obedience into flesh? To answer that, we must enter a world where pain was policy and freedom was only ever skin deep. Rome prided itself on order, the empire of marble, logic, and law. But beneath that order beat a darker rhythm, the obsession with control. The Roman world believed that authority was visible only when it left marks on stone, on parchment, and on the human body. Pain wasn't chaos, it was structure. Branding was not barbarism, it was policy. In Roman law, every life existed within hierarchy. Men owned property. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, owned not only his land, but every soul within it. Wives, children, and slaves were extensions of his dominion. Their flesh was not their own. His word was law, his anger divine. The Romans called it dominium, total ownership. To rule was to possess. To possess was to mark. Slaves were branded with the initials of their masters, or with symbols that declared their purpose: fug for fugitive, serve for service. Others bore numbers or emblems that matched them to a household. They were living ledgers, their flesh transformed into contracts. Women were caught in this web of ownership more deeply than anyone. A freeborn man's power was absolute. A woman's freedom existed only in theory. Even noble women were legally bound by the will of their fathers or husbands. For the enslaved and the poor, that control became physical, inked not in law, but in pain. Branding began as punishment for rebellion, but soon it evolved into identification, and from identification into ideology. A scar was a sentence that never expired. The mark reminded the branded and everyone who saw them who truly held power. The empire turned suffering into spectacle and obedience into art. In the bustling slave markets of Capua and Rome, auctioneers displayed bodies like livestock. The branding irons lay ready beside the ledgers. A newly purchased woman was branded in the presence of witnesses, the iron pressed into her shoulder or thigh, sealing her fate. The smell of burned skin was a signature. The crowd barely flinched. The Romans justified this cruelty with philosophy. The Stoics preached order above emotion. The jurists of the empire argued that discipline was the price of civilization. To them, the mark was not cruelty, it was civilization itself. A branded body was a body that had been ordered. It carried proof of ownership, a visual affirmation that Rome's structure reached all the way to the skin. The punishment extended beyond slaves. Prostitutes, considered infames, socially degraded, were marked as public property. Some bore the symbols of Venus, the goddess of love, branded not as honor, but as humiliation. Others carried the name of their brothel's owner, their beauty turned into advertisement. In the law's eyes, this branding made them identifiable, but in truth, it made them disposable. Even free women could fall under the fire. Under Roman morality codes, a wife accused of adultery could be punished by her husband with mutilation or branding. The law looked away. Her body became a warning to other women. Fidelity was not virtue, it was survival. Pain became documentation. The empire recorded its power not just through decrees or monuments, but through marks on human flesh. Branding replaced the written record for those considered unworthy of ink. Slaves couldn't read, so they were made to wear their sentences instead. It was bureaucracy by brutality. The deeper logic of branding revealed something sinister about Roman society, its hunger to make control visible. Rome didn't just want obedience, it wanted proof. A brand was a certificate of submission, a scar shaped like authority. Even punishment had to be beautiful in its symmetry, efficient in its cruelty. In Roman markets, masters competed to display their control through the quality of their slaves' marks. Clean burns, elegant letters, minimal scarring signs of discipline and wealth. A poorly branded slave suggested negligence, a flaw in the owner's order. Pain became aesthetic. Suffering became pride. Roman philosophers even moralized pain. Seneca wrote that discipline purified the soul. Cicero claimed that order required sacrifice. The state learned to merge ethics with violence, dressing domination in the language of virtue. To control another's body was not shameful, it was sacred. This ideology extended into religion. The temples echoed the same logic: purity through pain, devotion through obedience. Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to chastity, were buried alive if they broke their vows. Their punishment mirrored the branding ritual in philosophy, if not in form. Rome equated female disobedience with contamination. Every act of pain against women became a ritual of cleansing. In the empire's eyes, control wasn't merely social, it was cosmic. Every scar reinforced the illusion that Rome's order mirrored divine order. Chaos was feminine, control was masculine. The body of a woman symbolized temptation, disorder, and danger. Branding her, disciplining her, was the empire's way of asserting mastery over nature itself. That belief extended into the law's smallest details. A master could not be punished for branding his slave. A husband could not be tried for branding his wife. The only crime was damaging another man's property. Morality ended where ownership began. Through branding, the Romans turned cruelty into routine, the everyday theater of power. To them, a mark was not just a scar, it was a signature of civilization. And every burn left behind a quiet, horrifying truth, that the empire's greatness depended on pain, so normalized it became invisible. Rome believed it could turn violence into virtue, chaos into order, and flesh into parchment for its laws. It succeeded for centuries, but every mark it burned into the skin of its women also branded its own history with the stain of hypocrisy. Because an empire that builds its order on suffering may conquer the world, but it can never claim to be civilized. In ancient Rome, a woman's body could tell her story before she ever spoke. To the trained eye, the marks on her skin were sentences, declarations of who she belonged to, what she had done, and how much she was worth. In a world obsessed with control, the human body became the empire's most obedient parchment. The women who bore Rome's brands were not always criminals. Most were slaves captured in war, sold by poverty, or born into bondage. But others were victims of moral laws, punished for defiance, independence, or the crime of existing without a man's permission. Each mark was a signature of ownership, pressed into flesh with iron heated until it glowed like the sun. Roman branding wasn't random cruelty, it was a system. Slaves were catalogued with the precision of livestock. Some bore the initials of their masters, others the symbols of their trade: a vine leaf for tavern workers, a dolphin for bath attendants, a torch for prostitutes. These marks reduced complex human beings to roles within an economy of control. Women were branded differently. Their marks were placed where they could not be hidden: the shoulder, the arm, the thigh. The purpose was visibility. Their pain was meant to be seen, to remind everyone, themselves included, that they were property. The branding iron didn't just burn skin, it burned identity. Roman law treated women as property twice over. First, by nature of gender. Second, by circumstance. A slave woman belonged to her master, but even a free woman belonged to her husband or father. The empire's power flowed through male ownership, every woman an extension of a man's status. A brand made that power literal. In the markets of Rome, slaves were inspected like livestock. Buyers ran hands across backs, checked teeth, and asked questions about obedience. For women, one question mattered above all. Were they marked? A branded woman was considered trained, already broken in spirit, easier to command. The burn scars were both warning and advertisement. Roman brothels were full of such marks. Prostitutes were often branded by the leno, the brothel keeper, with small symbols that acted as licenses. Some bore the word meretrix, meaning one who earns. Others carried abbreviations for their owner's name. A woman might spend years trying to hide that mark, covering it with cloth or jewelry, but it always waited beneath the surface. To the Romans, branding was efficient morality. It divided the pure from the impure, the owned from the free. Wives were not officially branded by law, but that didn't mean they were safe. Historical accounts describe husbands punishing unfaithful wives by burning symbols onto their bodies: a serpent for deceit, a flame for lust. These punishments weren't legal trials, they were private rituals of humiliation. The Roman Senate turned away from such domestic matters, calling them acts of discipline. Roman writers like Juvenal mocked these women in their satires, describing them as restless bodies marked by shame. He called branding the ink of moral correction. To men like him, pain was education. To the women who lived it, it was erasure. Some of the most disturbing evidence comes not from text, but from archaeology. Inscriptions found on tombs and slave collars reveal the language of ownership in brutal simplicity. One reads, "I am the property of Marcus Livius. If you find me, return me to my master." Another, carved into bronze, bears the words, "Punished once for running, twice for lying, forever for being born a woman." The branding ritual itself was clinical, almost ceremonial. The woman was restrained sometimes by leather straps, sometimes by other slaves. The iron was heated in oil or coals, and when the executioner pressed it to her flesh, it hissed like breath from the underworld. The pain was instantaneous, but the humiliation lasted a lifetime. The Romans claimed the brand was a deterrent. In truth, it was spectacle, an act designed to remind others of their place. A branded woman could not testify in court, could not marry freely, and could never reclaim her status. She was visible proof of male power, walking evidence that Rome's hierarchy reached the body itself. Even religion participated. In temples dedicated to Venus or Juno, some fallen women were required to make offerings marked by their scars. The priests claimed it symbolized repentance, but it was not redemption, it was reinforcement. Rome's gods did not forgive, they recorded. The branding iron was not just an instrument of pain, it was a translator between law and flesh. Every burn said the same thing: you are less than whole. The empire didn't need chains once the mind accepted that message. Yet even within this cruelty, resistance existed. Some women hid their marks beneath tattoos of their own, making small patterns inked to reclaim what was taken. Others scarred themselves deliberately to distort the shape of their brands, turning their owners' names into unreadable lines. It was rebellion in miniature, quiet, invisible, but real. Occasionally, the empire's machinery cracked. A slave named Fortunata was branded twice for escaping her master in Pompeii. When she was finally caught, she declared in court, "Your mark fades, my will does not." The record ends there. No historian wrote what happened next, but the fact that her words survived copied by a clerk into a margin suggests even the empire couldn't fully erase her defiance. Roman men saw the body as proof of hierarchy. But to the branded women, those scars became proof of endurance. The very mark meant to shame them became the record of their survival. The empire reduced them to symbols and, in doing so, immortalized them. When archaeologists uncovered the skeletons of female slaves in Roman graves, they found bone healed around burn scars, evidence of lives lived long after branding. These women endured decades after the iron cooled. They cooked, raised children, whispered to one another, and passed down songs that mocked their masters behind closed doors. For them, every scar was both pain and memory. A brand could declare ownership, but it could not erase existence. The empire may have burned its mark into their skin, but unknowingly it burned its cruelty into history, because when the flesh healed, the mark remained. And long after Rome fell, those marks still spoke not of obedience, but of the power that never belonged to Rome at all. Rome did not hide its violence, it celebrated it. Pain was never private. The empire turned punishment into performance and suffering into civic virtue. The amphitheater was not the only stage for cruelty. The forum, the slave markets, and even the temples became theaters where justice was performed for applause. To the Roman mind, punishment wasn't meant to reform, it was meant to demonstrate control. And nothing demonstrated control better than pain that could be seen, smelled, and remembered. The body was Rome's billboard. Branding wasn't an act of rage, it was choreography. Every burn, every scream, every gasp of the crowd reinforced the illusion that Rome's order was eternal. Women bore the brunt of that spectacle. Their pain was considered morally instructive. When a slave woman was branded for defiance, citizens gathered as if attending a ceremony. The branding iron, dipped in oil, hissed as it met her skin, the sound sharp enough to cut through conversation. The crowd would murmur approval, not because they hated her, but because they loved what her suffering represented, proof that Rome's world still made sense. The empire's punishments were always public because control required witnesses. Slaves were branded before crowds to remind the free of their privilege. Prostitutes were marked in marketplaces to remind matrons of their virtue, and wives accused of infidelity were displayed to remind all women that even affection had limits. In some cases, the punishment was staged with perverse artistry. Historical sources describe branding sessions held during religious festivals. The priests would bless the iron before use, invoking Jupiter or Mars to purify the defiled. The crowd would cheer as the condemned was branded not in secret, but in sunlight. The act was framed not as cruelty, but as moral hygiene. Seneca wrote that pain is divine order made visible. The Romans believed the gods themselves sanctioned suffering as a means of balance. Every act of discipline reinforced the social hierarchy: men over women, masters over slaves, Rome over the world. Pain was the empire's proof of righteousness. In the Forum, branding punishments were scheduled alongside public speeches and gladiator games. Merchants paused their trades to watch. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. The punishments served dual-purpose entertainment and education. Rome called it spectaculum disciplinae, the spectacle of discipline. The most infamous punishments occurred in the Subura district, a neighborhood dense with brothels, taverns, and street theaters. There, prostitutes accused of defying their owners were branded in front of tavern doors. The crowd gathered close, the air heavy with wine and sweat. A magistrate would read her crimes aloud: insolence, disobedience, or theft, while the iron heated nearby. Each strike of the brand was met with laughter or cheers, followed by silence as the smell of burning skin drifted upward. But the cruelty was not random, it was organized. Every act of punishment had a script. A guard held the condemned, The executioner performed the branding, and the crowd confirmed the justice with noise. The same rhythm repeated across the empire, from Gaul to Egypt. Rome's power was theatrical consistency, the same pain everywhere, the same applause. Even in the grand arenas, branding was a prelude to death. Before executions, criminals and slaves were sometimes marked with the letter C for condemned. Women accused of sorcery or adultery were paraded first, branded second, and executed last, their suffering stretched for effect. The crowds didn't turn away, they leaned closer. The philosopher Cicero once boasted that public punishment kept citizens strong and vigilant. In reality, it kept them complicit. Watching others branded made the audience feel cleansed, not guilty. It reminded them that their safety depended on someone else's pain. Rome had weaponized empathy, turning it inside out. For women, the spectacle carried a special message. Their branding was sexualized, their humiliation moralized. Artists and poets even romanticized the marks, describing branded women as beautified by punishment. Statues in certain temples depicted mythological women marked by gods Callisto, Io, and Venus, their suffering carved into marble as divine symbolism. Rome's culture blurred the line between correction and desire. Some spectators attended these events not out of duty but fascination. The sight of a woman's skin branded was both horrifying and seductive, the empire's cruelest paradox. Pleasure and punishment merged. The same society that worshipped Venus also burned her daughters. The branding iron became more than a tool. It became theatre's prop, religion's relic, and justice's instrument. The line between executioner and priest grew thin. In certain temples, offerings were made by touching a heated brand to one's own hand, a symbolic purification, echoing the punishments done in public. Rome's cruelty was so complete that even devotion borrowed its imagery. Occasionally, the spectacle turned against itself. A senator's wife, caught for adultery, was once branded in private to avoid scandal. But the story leaked. The city buzzed with gossip. Poets mocked the hypocrisy of noble cruelty. "The same iron," one wrote, "that marks the slave now writes on the mistress." The irony stung. For a brief moment, the public saw what the empire tried to hide, that control was never justice. It was fear dressed as virtue. Despite the horror, the theatre of punishment served a political purpose. The emperor's rule relied on visibility. The people needed to see power enacted to believe it existed. Branding turned invisible authority into tangible spectacle. Each mark burned into a woman's body became propaganda for the empire's strength. But the true cruelty lay in the illusion that it was justice. The crowd believed they were watching sin purified. In reality, they were watching control reaffirmed. Every scream was applause for the system. Every scar was proof that fear worked. Over centuries, the ritual became tradition. The instruments changed shape, the crowds grew larger, but the meaning never shifted. Pain remained proof of power, and spectacle remained Rome's favorite mirror. When Rome finally fell, its theaters turned to ruins, but the logic of spectacle endured. The branding iron became metaphor. Public shaming replaced physical burns. The urge to witness humiliation survived empires disguised as entertainment, gossip, or moral outrage. Rome taught the world that pain, when performed beautifully, could look like order. That cruelty, if given ceremony, could feel like justice. And somewhere in that theatre, between the hiss of iron and the silence of the crowd, civilization revealed its darkest secret, that what people called justice was often just the art of watching someone else suffer. To Rome, branding was more than punishment, it was ritual. Fire did not merely destroy, it transformed. Every burn was a sermon, every scar a verse in the empire's theology of obedience. When the iron met flesh, it was not just a master, marking a slave, it was Rome stamping its soul onto the body of its people. Fire had always been sacred. In temples across the empire, flames burned eternally in honor of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. The same fire that cooked food and forged weapons also purified sin. To the Romans, heat was divine order made visible. It consumed impurity and left behind discipline. The branding iron borrowed this sanctity. Pain became a form of purification, a visible reminder that the empire's order required sacrifice. The process itself resembled religious ceremony. Before the iron was pressed to skin, some masters performed prayers calling on gods to witness the act. As this mark burns into flesh, one inscription reads, "So may loyalty burn into her spirit." The conflation of devotion and domination was deliberate. Rome's cruelty wasn't senseless, it was spiritualized. Religious justification made pain righteous. The gods, priests claimed, demanded purity through suffering. When a slave woman was branded, it was said that her body was being cleansed of rebellion. When a wife was burned for infidelity, she was purified by flame. The branding iron became both weapon and altar. The empire's obsession with purity blurred the lines between justice and sanctity. Fire symbolized both creation and control. To the Romans, everything pure had to pass through heat metal, food, and souls alike. The branding iron simply extended that logic to flesh. For women, this ideology carried particular cruelty. The Roman world equated femininity with chaos, temptation, and weakness. The female body was seen as porous, open to sin, desire, and disorder. Branding sealed that body, transforming it from dangerous to contained. It was less about punishment than possession, less about justice than reassurance. The mark made men believe they had reclaimed order from temptation. In temples dedicated to Juno, goddess of marriage, rituals often involved the symbolic act of binding fire. Newlywed women touched heated metal rings to their forearms, a gesture of fidelity and endurance. Though these rituals were symbolic, they echoed the same theology as branding, pain as proof of loyalty. Even the language of branding revealed its religious undertones. The Latin word signum, meaning mark, was the same word used for sacred symbols. A branded body was not simply punished, it was signed. The empire saw its marks as divine signatures of belonging. The act of burning became a perverse imitation of baptism, not water cleansing the soul, but fire cleansing disobedience. The parallels between punishment and piety ran deep. In early Christianity, followers who refused to renounce their faith were branded with crosses or burned alive. Yet over time, they transformed those scars into emblems of resistance. The same fire that Rome used for control became, in the eyes of the persecuted, a mark of salvation. Martyrdom reversed the meaning of pain. When St. Agnes was branded for defying a Roman nobleman, her burns were said to glow instead of blacken. Pain turned to holiness, suffering to symbol. The empire had built its theology on fear, but its victims discovered a deeper faith, one that reclaimed fire from cruelty. Still, most women never found redemption in pain. The fire that branded them was not metaphor, but reality, a daily reminder of subjugation. And yet, even in that suffering, there existed a twisted intimacy between tormentor and victim. The iron kissed the skin, the fire whispered obedience. Pain created a connection more permanent than love. Rome understood that. Control required ritual, and ritual required witnesses. Every branding echoed the empire's divine hierarchy. The master was Jupiter supreme, wrathful, just. The branded was mortal, sinful, redeemed only through obedience. This theology made cruelty sustainable. It turned violence into virtue and hierarchy into holiness. The empire could not have survived without its gods, but neither could its gods have survived without its pain. Art reflected this belief with chilling beauty. Mosaics and frescoes depicted gods punishing mortals with flame, Prometheus bound, Hercules purged in fire, Venus scorched by jealousy. Artists painted agony as ascension. The Romans saw suffering not as horror, but as spectacle sanctified. To brand a woman was to reenact myth, to play the role of God, imposing divine order upon chaos. It was theatre of holiness where faith became justification and pain became proof. Even as Christianity spread, the logic remained. The empire adopted new symbols but kept the same belief, that pain refines. Women accused of heresy or witchcraft centuries later would be burned for purification, the direct descendant of Rome's theology. The fire never died, it simply changed its script. What made this ideology so powerful was its elegance. Fire was natural, pure, inevitable. The Romans used it to mask their cruelty in beauty. The glowing iron was mesmerizing, the smoke almost ceremonial. To watch it was to feel that something sacred was happening. It was control disguised as cleansing, obedience disguised as devotion. The symbolism extended to language itself. Roman poets describe branded women as touched by flame, purified by the gods, sealed with virtue. Their scars became metaphors for moral redemption. By aestheticizing pain, the empire ensured no one would question its necessity. And yet beneath that poetry burned a darker truth. Fire may purify metal, but it destroys flesh. It leaves not clarity, but scars. What Rome called purification was annihilation, the erasure of individuality in the name of order. Over centuries, the empire taught generations to see suffering as sacred. Even today, the echoes remain. We romanticize endurance, glorify suffering, and worship control. The idea that pain leads to virtue born in Roman temples and forged in iron still lingers in the human psyche. Fire, flesh, and faith, three words that built a civilization and burned through its conscience. Rome believed it could sanctify cruelty. But every time the iron hissed, it betrayed a deeper truth, that what the empire worshipped most was not its gods, but its own reflection in the flames. Rome fell, its temples collapsed, its emperors turned to dust, its language fractured into echoes. But some parts of empire do not die, they evolve. The branding irons were buried, but the ideas that forged them still glow beneath our skin. The Romans didn't just scar bodies, they scarred humanity's understanding of control. The empire's cruelty didn't vanish, it adapted. It learned to hide behind civility, to change its iron for ink, its fire for words. Rome, its logic of ownership that pain defines value and visibility, defines virtue, still governs how the world treats women. We may not burn marks into flesh anymore, but we brand reputations, bodies, and identities with the same precision. Today, the mark is not seared by iron, but by expectation. The modern world worships beauty instead of purity, but the ritual is the same, conformity enforced by pain. The cosmetics industry, the fashion machine, the algorithmic gaze, each demands obedience to an invisible master. The woman's body remains the empire's canvas, its perfection still measured in suffering. Wax instead of flame, hunger instead of iron, silence instead of chains. And just like in ancient Rome, the audience applauds. Billboards, screens, and social media have replaced the amphitheater. Women are still displayed, still judged, still branded, not with letters of ownership, but with labels of worth. Beautiful, faithful, problematic, pure. The crowd scrolls, comments, and condemns, never realizing they are cheering for the same spectacle that once took place in the Forum. In the digital Colosseum, the punishment is no longer physical. It's reputational public shaming dressed as justice. A mistake becomes a scar, a rumor becomes a mark. Once again, pain becomes performance. The difference is that now the executioner is everyone with a connection. The Roman obsession with purity through pain survived as moral culture. Medieval inquisitors burned witches to cleanse sin. Victorian men institutionalized women for hysteria, their minds the new flesh to brand. Even today, when a woman is criticized for her past, her clothes, or her body, the logic is the same: to mark her as unworthy, to make her wear shame like an invisible scar. The echo of the Roman mark lives on in language itself. We still say marked for life, tainted, scarlet letter. The metaphors survive because the mentality does. Society still demands proof of virtue and still defines that virtue through control. Every scar, whether visible or psychological, traces back to that Roman idea. That power must be proven by pain. The empire taught that dominance requires ritual, that obedience must be performed publicly, and that a woman's silence is civilization's proof of order. Those ideas spread through religion, law, and art until they became invisible, not questioned, just inherited. Rome's greatest legacy wasn't its architecture or its armies, it was the normalization of cruelty. It taught the world that hierarchy is holy and pain is purifying, that to be governed is to be marked. Even our modern laws, with their bureaucratic signatures and digital IDs, echo the ancient logic that identity is something given, not owned. And yet, in the quiet corners of history, the branded women outlasted the empire that burned them. The iron faded, the stories did not. Archaeologists still uncover slave collars, bronze plates, and graffiti carved by trembling hands, messages left in defiance. One fragment reads, "My master's name will fade before my scar." It was not prophecy, but it came true. Rome's masters are forgotten, their victims are remembered. What these women endured was more than physical torment, it was the theft of identity. But in surviving, they created something the empire could never control: legacy. Every scar became a testament to endurance, every mark a relic of resistance. They were branded to erase their humanity, and instead they branded history with their existence. When we speak of Rome today, we speak its ruins but also its ghosts. The echo of their suffering shapes our morality, our beauty, our silence. Every time we mistake pain for virtue or obedience for strength, we are hearing that echo. Every time a woman is judged for her past or her body, we are repeating the empire's oldest prayer: control through shame. But history has changed. The same voices that once whispered in the dark now speak in the open. The stories, buried under centuries of silence, have resurfaced in archives, in art, in documentaries like this one. The iron's hiss has become the voice of remembrance. The same flames that once destroyed now illuminate. The mark, once a symbol of ownership, has become a symbol of survival. The women who bore it unwillingly have become the authors of their own myth, not as victims, but as witnesses. Their pain is no longer the empire's propaganda, it is evidence of its failure. Because no matter how deeply Rome tried to burn obedience into the flesh, it could never brand the spirit. The empire's power ended when the fire cooled, but the memory of resistance endured. The mark meant to dehumanize became proof of humanity, and so when we look at the ruins of Rome, its crumbling pillars, its silent amphitheaters, we should remember what truly survived: not the emperors, not the armies, but the echoes of those who endured them. The women whose pain was turned into law, whose suffering became theology, and whose silence built civilization. They are still here in the scars we inherit and the truths we finally dare to tell. Because the fire that once branded them is still burning, but now it burns in remembrance, not obedience. The empire's mark has faded from skin, but not from the world's memory. Every act of judgment, every moral performance, every obsession with control is a faint reflection of that ancient iron. But so too is every act of defiance, every voice that refuses to be silenced. The question Rome leaves us with is not how it fell, but whether we've ever truly escaped it. The branding irons are gone, the marks remain,